possibility of a nuclear weapon in the hands of the Third Reich was not just a strategic concern for the Allies, but it was the ultimate nightmare scenario that kept the leaders of the free world awake at night. While the United States was pouring billions of dollars and mobilizing its greatest scientific minds for the Manhattan Project, a terrifying silence hung over the scientific progress of Nazi Germany. The Allies knew that German physicists had discovered nuclear fission first in 1938, and they knew that Werner Heisenberg, a Nobel Prize winner and one of the most brilliant minds in history, was leading Hitler's uranium club. The question that haunted General Leslie Groves, the director of the American nuclear program, was not if the Germans were building a bomb, but rather how close they were to dropping it on London or Washington. To answer this question, traditional espionage was simply not enough, because regular spies did not understand physics and could not differentiate between a nuclear reactor and a heavy water production plant. General Groves realized he needed a new kind of special force that had never existed before in the history of warfare. He needed a unit that combined the tactical lethality of frontline commandos with the intellectual capacity of nuclear physicists. This realization led to the creation of the ALSOS mission, a top-secret operation with a singular and dangerous objective to follow directly behind the invading Allied armies, infiltrate enemy laboratories, capture Nazi scientists, and seize their uranium before they could unleash the power of the atom. The man chosen to lead the military side of this operation was Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, a man who seemed to be carved out of granite and possessed a fearless reputation for hunting down communist sympathizers and subversives. Boris Pash was not a scientist, but he was a man of action who famously drove into liberated Paris before the main Allied forces just to secure a target. However, Pash needed a scientific counterpart who could understand the papers they stole and the scientists they interrogated. That role fell to Samuel Goudsmit, a brilliant Dutch-American physicist who had personally known Heisenberg before the war and possessed a sharp mind capable of piecing together the fragmented puzzle of the German nuclear program. If you are enjoying this dive into the secret history of World War II and want to see more untold stories from the archives, please take a brief moment to hit the subscribe button right now, so you do not miss our future investigations. The partnership between Boris Pash and Samuel Goudsmit created a fascinating dynamic where a hard-nosed military officer and an academic intellectual had to navigate the chaos of a collapsing Europe together. Their mission officially began in Italy in late 1943, following the Allied invasion, but their early results were frustratingly thin because the Germans had systematically retreated and taken their most sensitive equipment with them. The team moved through the rubble of Italian universities, interrogating scientists who had been left behind, but they found only vague rumors and disconnected data points. It became clear to Pash and Goudsmit that they would not find the answers they needed in the periphery of the war. They had to go into the heart of the beast. As the Allies prepared for the massive invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, the stakes for the ALSOS mission were raised to a critical level. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans might use radioactive poisons to contaminate the beaches of France and stop the invasion force in its tracks. Armed with Geiger counters and a deep sense of dread, the scientific teams accompanied the first waves of the invasion force to test the sand and the air for radiation. Fortunately, the beaches were clean, but the race was now on to reach Paris, and then push onward into Germany itself. The mission was dangerous because the ALSOS team operated in a strange gray zone where they often found themselves ahead of the regular army units. Colonel Boris Pasch organized a small, mobile strike force that he called the T-Force, which was designed to punch through enemy lines and seize targets before the retreating German units could destroy the evidence. The primary target on their list was the University of Strasbourg in France, which was still under German occupation but was known to house several key physicists who were working on the project. The capture of Strasbourg became an obsession for the team because they believed that hidden within the university laboratories were the personal papers of Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who was Heisenberg's right-hand man. Goudsmit believed that these papers would finally reveal the true status of the Nazi bomb project. The advance toward Strasbourg was fraught with danger as pockets of German resistance fought desperately to hold the line. Boris Pasch, displaying his characteristic aggression, did not wait for the area to be fully secured by infantry. He led his jeeps and trucks into the city, while sniper fire still echoed through the streets and artillery shells landed in the distance. The team navigated through the confused urban combat, dodging debris and military checkpoints, driving straight for the Physics Institute of the university. This was the moment they had been training for, and the adrenaline was high because they knew that every second wasted gave the Germans more time to burn documents and smash prototypes. When they finally breached the university buildings, the scene was chaotic, with papers scattered across floors and equipment hastily abandoned. Samuel Goudsmit immediately began sifting through the piles of documents, looking for anything that mentioned uranium, heavy water, or the separation of isotopes. What he found in those cluttered offices would change the entire understanding of the war. He discovered a collection of letters and calculations that had been left behind in the panic of the retreat. These were not just administrative records, but they were personal correspondences between the top scientists of the Third Reich. As Goudsmit sat in the freezing office reading through the handwritten notes of his former colleagues, a picture began to form that was both shocking and confusing. The documents discussed the difficulties of creating a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, but the math seemed to suggest that the Germans were far behind the Americans. However, Goudsmit had to be careful because this could have been a sophisticated counterintelligence plant designed to make the Allies lower their guard. The team had to decide whether to trust these papers or to assume that the real work was happening somewhere else, deeper inside Germany, in a fortress that was still out of their reach. The discovery at Strasbourg was a turning point, but it was not the end of the mission. It only deepened the mystery of where Werner Heisenberg was hiding and what he was truly working on. The intelligence indicated that the core of the German nuclear research had been moved south to the Black Forest region to escape the relentless Allied bombing raids. This meant that the ALSOS mission would have to spearhead a deep penetration into the final redoubt of the Nazi Empire. Boris Pasch began planning an operation that would take his small unit across the Rhine River and into the mountainous terrain where the fanatical remnants of the German army were preparing for their last stand. As the Allied armies finally crossed the Rhine River in early 1945, the ALSOS mission shifted gears from investigation to a high-speed manhunt. Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pasch knew that the time for sifting through old papers was over, because the final collapse of the Third Reich was imminent. Every hour of delay increased the risk that Nazi scientists would destroy their research or vanish into the Bavarian Alps to conduct a last stand. The primary target for this new aggressive phase was the ancient university city of Heidelberg, which had served as a prestigious hub for German physics for generations. The intelligence reports indicated that while the top leadership of the project had moved south, key figures remained in Heidelberg. The city fell to American troops with relatively little damage, and the ALSOS team rolled in directly behind the combat units, heading straight for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research. There, Samuel Goudsmit finally came face-to-face with Walter Bother, a leading German experimentalist who had built the first cyclotron in Germany. The meeting was tense and filled with silent professional rivalry. Bother stood in his laboratory amidst his life's work and greeted the Americans with cold, aristocratic politeness. He refused to answer specific questions about the atomic bomb, citing his duty to his country. But the equipment around him told its own story. Goudsmit inspected the laboratory with a mixture of relief and confusion. The equipment was of high quality, but it was not the industrial-scale machinery required to produce a nuclear weapon in mass quantities. It seemed that while the United States had built massive factory cities in Tennessee and Washington, the Germans were still conducting their nuclear research in academic laboratories that looked like they belonged in the 1920s. However, the interrogation of lower-level staff at the Institute provided the breakthrough that Pasch had been praying for. They revealed that the core of the uranium project, including Werner Heisenberg and the entire stockpile of nuclear fuel, had been evacuated to the Black Forest region in the southwest of Germany. The specific locations identified were the small towns of Heckingen and Hagerloch. This information confirmed the worst fears of Allied intelligence because the Nazis were concentrating their most dangerous scientific assets in the exact area where Hitler was rumored to be planning a suicidal final defense. If Heisenberg succeeded in building a functional weapon in that mountainous terrain, he could use it to hold the invading armies hostage. However, a significant political complication threatened to derail the entire mission. The maps drawn up by Allied leaders designated the Black Forest as part of the future French occupation zone. The American and British leadership were deeply distrustful of the French government's ability to secure nuclear secrets, fearing that any technology captured by the French would eventually leak to the Soviet Union. General Leslie Groves gave Boris Pasch a set of secret orders that were technically a violation of the alliance agreements. Pasch was instructed to race into the area assigned to the French, capture the scientists, seize the uranium, and escape before the French army could establish control. This directive launched Operation Harborage, one of the most audacious maneuvers of the entire war. Boris Pasch assembled a heavy strike force that was far more powerful than previous ALSOS units. He gathered a column of jeeps, trucks, and armored vehicles, preparing to drive straight into the chaos of a collapsing Germany. The T-Force moved with such speed that they frequently outpaced the supporting infantry divisions, driving through narrow, winding roads in dense woods that were perfect for ambushes. They bypassed pockets of German resistance and ignored towns that were not on their direct path, driven by the singular goal of reaching the targets before the French army arrived from the west. As the convoy pushed deeper into the south, they began to find physical evidence of the dispersed German nuclear program. They discovered makeshift laboratories set up in textile mills and breweries, proving that the scientists had tried to continue their work even as their cities were being bombed. It was a surreal sight for the American team to see advanced physics equipment sitting next to vats of beer and weaving looms. But the ultimate prize was waiting in the town of Hagerloch. Prisoners captured along the way spoke of a secret laboratory hidden inside a cave carved into the side of a cliff, located directly beneath a castle church. The tension peaked as the T-Force arrived in Hagerloch. The town was eerily quiet, holding its breath as the foreign vehicles roared through the streets. Boris Pasch secured the perimeter and led the way toward the cliffs with his weapon ready. Samuel Goudsmit followed close behind, his heart pounding with the anticipation of finally seeing the German nuclear engine. They located the entrance to the cave, which was protected by heavy steel doors. Inside, they found a facility that was damp, dark, and filled with the low hum of ventilation fans. In the center of the main chamber was a deep concrete pit. Goudsmit peered into the pit and saw the German attempt at a nuclear reactor. It was a heavy metal vessel with a thick lid, designed to hold uranium cubes suspended in heavy water to create a chain reaction. It was an impressive piece of engineering, but to Goudsmit's trained eye, it revealed a crucial truth. The reactor lacked the critical mass and the necessary control mechanisms to generate an explosion. It was an experimental pile, not a weapon of war. The world was safe from a German atomic bomb for the moment. However, the mission was not a complete success because the pit was empty of fuel. The uranium cubes were missing, the heavy water was gone, and most importantly, Werner Heisenberg was nowhere to be found. The legendary physicist had fled just days before, taking the most dangerous materials with him deeper into the Alpine fortress. The discovery of the empty reactor pit in the Hagerloch cave was a bitter victory for the ALSOS mission. They had found the gun, but the bullets were missing. Boris Pasch stood in the damp, echoing chamber and realized that their job was only half done. Without the uranium and the heavy water, the reactor was just a pile of metal and concrete. But in the hands of the escaping scientists, the fuel could still be used to build a dirty bomb or restart the program elsewhere. The American team immediately rounded up the German scientists who had been left behind to guard the facility. These men were terrified, caught between their fear of the SS and their fear of the conquering Americans. Colonel Pasch and Samuel Goudsmit began a rapid and intense interrogation right there in the shadow of the castle church. The clock was ticking loudly, because the French army was reportedly only hours away. Pasch made it clear that the scientists would be treated as prisoners of war unless they cooperated immediately. Under the pressure, one of the administrators broke down. He gestured toward a freshly plowed field just outside the town. He explained that they had buried the most valuable treasure of the Third Reich in the dirt, like common pirates burying gold. The T-Force soldiers grabbed shovels and marched to the field. It was a surreal scene as heavily armed American troops began digging in the German countryside while their commanders watched nervously. After a short time, their shovels hit wood. They uncovered a large wooden box. Inside the box, they found heavy black cubes. These were the uranium cubes, the fuel for the nuclear reactor. The soldiers continued to dig, and one by one, they pulled nearly all of the missing uranium out of the earth. Goudsmit examined the cubes with a grim satisfaction. This was the material that could have destroyed London, now sitting harmlessly in a muddy field. However, the heavy water was still missing. The scientists revealed that it had been hidden in a nearby textile mill, disguised as ordinary industrial chemicals. The team raced to the mill and found large drums filled with the precious liquid. In the world of nuclear physics, heavy water was incredibly difficult to produce, and capturing it was just as important as capturing the uranium. With the fuel and the moderator now in American hands, the German nuclear project was effectively dead. But Boris Pasch had one more problem to solve. He wanted to destroy the cave laboratory so that no one, not even the French, could ever use it again. His initial plan was to blow the cave entrance with explosives, collapsing the cliff face. However, the local priest rushed out of the church that sat directly on top of the rock. He pleaded with Pasch, explaining that a large explosion would shatter the foundations of the magnificent Baroque church above. Pasch, despite his ruthless reputation, respected the plea. Instead of using dynamite, he ordered his men to wreck the facility by hand. They smashed the gauges, cut the wires, and dismantled the specialized equipment. Then, as a final touch, 2 British officers who were attached to the mission grabbed a couple of acetylene torches and cut the steel lid of the reactor vessel into pieces. The scene in Heggerloch was one of organized chaos as the Americans loaded the heavy drums of water and the crates of uranium onto their trucks. They were stripping the town of its scientific secrets with the efficiency of a moving company. Just as the last truck was loaded and the convoy began to pull out, the vanguard of the French army appeared on the horizon. The timing had been perfect. The French marched into the town to take possession of their occupation zone, completely unaware that the Americans had already looted the most valuable prize in the entire region. With the physical components of the bomb secured, the focus of the mission shifted back to the human element. They had the machine and the fuel, but the mastermind was still loose. Werner Heisenberg was the final piece of the puzzle. The captured scientists in Heggerloch had given up his general location. He was hiding in a small mountain cabin in the village of Urfeld, high in the Bavarian Alps. This was enemy territory that had not yet been fully cleared by Allied troops. The region was swarming with die-hard SS units who were refusing to surrender, making the journey treacherous. Colonel Pasch did not wait for backup. He selected a small team of his toughest men and began the ascent into the mountains. The roads were covered in snow and ice, and the air grew thinner as they climbed. This was the final hunt. Goudsmit stayed behind to coordinate the transport of the nuclear materials, while Pasch drove his jeep forward, determined to arrest the most famous scientist in the world. As they approached the Alpine village, the atmosphere was tense. Every turn in the road could hide an ambush. But Pasch was driven by a single thought. He wanted to be the man who told the President of the United States that the German nuclear threat was officially over. The journey to Urfeld felt like a climb into the sky. The scenery was breathtakingly beautiful, a stark contrast to the ugly reality of the war. When the small convoy finally reached the village, they found it eerily peaceful. Heisenberg was not in a fortress or a bunker. He was sitting in his office inside his cabin, looking out at the snowy landscape. He had been expecting them. The man who had terrified the Allied leadership for years was just a tired academic waiting for the end. When Boris Pasch walked into the room, submachine gun in hand, Werner Heisenberg stood up. He did not resist. In fact, He seemed almost relieved that the game was finally up. He asked Pash if he could pack his bags. The most dangerous intellect of the Axis powers was now in American custody. But, as Pash escorted Heisenberg to the jeep, the scientist made a comment that chilled the Americans. He asked about the progress of the American bomb, assuming that he, Heisenberg, was still the leader in the field of nuclear physics. He had no idea that while he was struggling to build a reactor in a cave, the Americans were preparing to test a real weapon in the desert of New Mexico. With Werner Heisenberg and the other top German physicists in Allied custody, the shooting war was over for the ALSOS mission, but the psychological war was just beginning. The United States and Britain had a unique problem. They had captured 10 of the most brilliant minds in the world, men who carried the secrets of nuclear fission in their heads. They could not simply release them because the Soviet Union was already hunting for talent to build their own atomic program. However, they could not treat them like common war criminals either, because their knowledge was too valuable. The solution was a secret operation code-named Epsilon. The 10 scientists, including Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, were flown out of Europe and transported to a stately country house in England called Farm Hall. To the scientists, it looked like a gentleman's retreat. They were given comfortable bedrooms, a piano to play, good food, and a garden to walk in. They were treated as distinguished guests of His Majesty's government. But Farm Hall was actually a high-tech prison. Before the Germans arrived, British intelligence agents had wired the entire building with hidden microphones. There were listening devices inside the light fixtures, behind the wallpaper, and even in the flower pots in the garden. The goal was simple yet devious. The Allies wanted to know, without any doubt, how close the Germans had actually come to the bomb. Interrogations could be beaten by smart men who knew how to lie, but private conversations between colleagues would reveal the truth. In the basement of Farm Hall, a team of bilingual British officers sat day and night with headphones, transcribing every word the scientists said. For months, the transcripts revealed a group of men who were still trapped in their own arrogance. They complained about the food and the boredom, but they also spoke with absolute certainty about their scientific superiority. Heisenberg and his colleagues truly believed that they were years ahead of the Allies. They speculated that the Americans and the British were probably still in the kindergarten stages of nuclear research. In their private talks, they convinced themselves that the reason they were being held was that the Allies needed their help. They imagined that soon American generals would come to them, hat in hand, asking for lessons on how to build a uranium reactor. They had no idea that while they were drinking tea in an English garden, the Manhattan Project was preparing to drop the sun on the Japanese Empire. The turning point came on the evening of August 6, 1945. The scientists were gathering for dinner when the British officer in charge, Major Rittner, told Otto Hahn the news. He informed him that an American airplane had just dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Hahn, who was the man who had originally discovered nuclear fission, was shattered. He felt a deep personal responsibility for the death and destruction, fearing that his scientific discovery had unleashed hell on Earth. But when he told the other scientists, the reaction was not guilt, but total disbelief. Werner Heisenberg literally did not believe it. He told his colleagues that it was a bluff, a propaganda lie invented by the Americans to force a Japanese surrender. He argued that it was physically impossible to separate enough uranium-235 to build a bomb in such a short time. He began rattling off calculations at the dinner table, trying to prove with mathematics that the Americans were lying. This was the moment the hidden microphones had been waiting for. The Allies were finally hearing the unvarnished truth of German incompetence. As the evening wore on, and the official news reports confirmed the destruction of Hiroshima, the mood in Farm Hall shifted from disbelief to shock. The reality crashed down on them. The Americans, whom they had dismissed as scientifically inferior, had achieved the impossible. The United States had done in 3 years what the Germans had failed to do in 6. The transcripts from that night show the German scientists grappling with a complete collapse of their worldview. They were not the masters of the universe anymore. They were second-rate failures who had been left behind by history. Otto Hahn was so distraught that the other scientists feared he might take his own life. He felt the weight of 100,000 deaths on his conscience. Meanwhile, the younger scientists began to turn on their elders. They blamed the lack of organization and the lack of funding from the Nazi government. But deeply, they knew the failure was also their own. They had miscalculated the critical mass. They had wasted time on heavy water when they should have used graphite. They had lacked the industrial vision that the Americans possessed. In the days that followed, a fascinating psychological transformation took place, which historians later called the Lessart, or the version. Realizing that their professional reputations were ruined, the scientists began to construct a new narrative to save face. They started to claim in their recorded conversations that they had never really wanted to build a bomb for Hitler. They told each other that they had intentionally dragged their feet and sabotaged the project from within because they were morally opposed to giving the Nazis such a terrible weapon. This was a convenient lie that allowed them to claim a moral victory in the face of scientific defeat. They began to style themselves as the guardians of humanity who had kept the genie in the bottle, contrasting themselves with the Americans who had actually used the weapon. The listening officers in the basement recorded this shift in real time. They watched as the scientists rewrote history to protect their egos. However, the earlier transcripts proved that this moral stance was a fabrication. Earlier in the war, they had worked tirelessly to build a reactor and had only failed because of errors in physics and the relentless bombing of their factories. The Farm Hall tapes remain one of the most extraordinary documents of the Second World War. They provide a raw, unfiltered look into the minds of men who had made a pact with the devil and lost. They revealed that the German failure was not a noble act of sabotage, but a combination of arrogance, calculation errors, and the crushing industrial power of the United States. The ALSOS mission had started with the fear of a Nazi superweapon, but it ended with the realization that the German scientists were just men, flawed and defeated, sitting in an English drawing room, trying to explain away their failure, while the world changed forever outside their window. With the mystery solved and the threat neutralized, the Americans had to decide what to do with their guests. The war was over, but the Cold War was rising from the ashes. The knowledge these men possessed was still dangerous, and although they had failed to build a bomb for Hitler, they could certainly help build one for Stalin. The game of shadows was not ending. It was just changing players. The final chapter of the ALSOS mission would not be written on the battlefield, but in the quiet, dusty offices where the future of the nuclear age would be decided. In January of 1946, the bus carrying the German scientists finally left the gates of Farm Hall. The golden cage was open, and the men were returned to a Germany that was unrecognizable. The cities they had known were reduced to oceans of brick and twisted metal, and the universities where they had once held court were now under the administration of military governors. Werner Heisenberg and his colleagues were settled in the British occupation zone, specifically in the university town of Göttingen. They were free men, but they were also watched men. They were allowed to rebuild the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was soon renamed the Max Planck Institute, but they were strictly forbidden from working on anything related to nuclear fission. For Samuel Goudsmit, the end of the mission brought a different kind of closure, one that was far more personal and tragic. During the chaotic days of the ALSOS mission, while he was hunting for atomic secrets, he had also been hunting for news of his parents, who were Jewish and had remained in the Netherlands during the occupation. It was only after the war ended that he confirmed the terrible truth that they had been murdered in a concentration camp. When Goudsmit stood in the ruins of the German laboratories, interrogating men like Heisenberg, he was not just an American officer doing a job. He was facing the intellectual enablers of a regime that had destroyed his family. This personal pain fueled a bitter public feud that lasted for years after the war. Goudsmit published a book titled ALSOS, in which he systematically dismantled the myth of the German nuclear prowess. He argued passionately that science could not flourish under a totalitarian dictatorship. He pointed out that the Nazis had driven away their best Jewish minds, allowed politics to interfere with physics, and promoted incompetent men based on party loyalty. To Goudsmit, the failure of the German bomb project was the inevitable result of a system that hated freedom. On the other side, Werner Heisenberg fought to protect his legacy with the carefully crafted story that had been born at Farm Hall. He traveled the world giving lectures, presenting himself as a man of peace who had quietly sabotaged the war effort from the inside. For decades, the world was divided on who to believe. Was Heisenberg a bungler who failed to do the math? Or was he a saint who refused to give Hitler the ultimate weapon? It was not until the release of the Farm Hall transcripts many years later that the historical record finally sided with Goudsmit. The tapes proved that the Germans had tried very hard to build the reactor, but they simply did not know how to do it. While the scientists fought their war of words, Colonel Boris Pasch faded back into the shadows where he was most comfortable. The success of the ALSOS mission had proven the value of scientific intelligence, and Pasch became a key figure in this new world. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and the Army in various capacities, dealing with the rising threat of the Soviet Union. The lessons learned in the race across Europe became the playbook for the Cold War. The United States realized that in the atomic age, you could not wait for a war to start before you investigated the enemy's weapons. You had to be proactive, invasive, and sometimes ruthless. The ALSOS mission effectively created the model for modern nuclear non-proliferation. The tactics used by Pasch and Goudsmit to sniff out uranium, track down centrifuges, and interview scientists are the ancestors of the inspections we see today in places like Iran or North Korea. The mission established the precedent that weapons of mass destruction are not just a military problem, but a global problem that justifies extraordinary measures. The image of American troops dismantling a reactor in a cave in Hagerloch is the first chapter in a long history of the world trying to keep the nuclear genie from spreading any further. It is also important to recognize what the ALSOS mission prevented. If the French had captured the scientists, the delicate balance of the post-war alliance could have fractured much earlier. If the Soviets had reached Heckingen first, the Russian atomic bomb project might have advanced years ahead of schedule. The Soviets did manage to capture other, less prominent scientists and a significant amount of raw material in the Eastern territories. But the crown jewels of the German program, the Nobel Prize winners and the heavy water, were secured by the United States. This gave the West a crucial psychological and technical advantage in the early years of the standoff with Moscow. As we look back at this incredible story 70 years later, it reads like a thriller, but it serves as a stark reminder of the fragile line between history and catastrophe. We often assume that technological progress is a straight line, and that the most advanced nation will always win. But the story of the Nazi bomb shows us that science does not exist in a vacuum. It requires resources, clear communication, and truth. The Nazis failed because they built a society based on lies, and eventually, those lies corrupted their ability to understand the physical world. The men of the ALSOS mission were an odd collection of professors and commandos, united by a desperate fear that the bad guys were winning. They drove their jeeps into the heart of the enemy territory, armed with Geiger counters and machine guns, not knowing what they would find around the next bend. They did not find a superweapon, but they found something just as important. They found the truth. And in doing so, they ensured that the darkness of the Third Reich did not extend into the atomic age. So there you have it, the complete declassified story of the secret mission to kidnap Nazi scientists. It is a tale of bravery, science, and the terrifying uncertainty of war. If you want to join us for more deep dives into the hidden chapters of history, please make sure to click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. We have many more secrets to uncover, and we want you to be there with us. Thanks for watching.